Helen. Tell us about you.
Well, thanks. I'm Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, and my day job is as a professor at the University of Southern California of education and psychology and neuroscience, and I'm the director of the Center for Affective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education, which is CANDLE. And what we're trying to understand is why these kinds of schools that you're running matter so much, right? And why the question of how you feel actually taps into such a deep well of importance within us, right? So what we're studying basically is how people come to have feelings, the ways in which people experience, and I mean that in a verb-like way, like the way we experience our lives, the meanings we make, the narratives we construct inside our own minds and together in community that really shape the way that we witness and experience everything that happens and how and what we think about, which is completely central to the experience of being in any kind of community, and especially one that is meant to grow you over time like a school. So we study brain development and the ways that emotions and feelings and consciousness and all that kind of come together for young people and for teachers now. We're doing neuroimaging with teachers too, to look at how they experience their world and how we can support them.
Thank you. Fascinating. Lots of questions to ask around that coming up, like, are emotions real from a molecular standpoint, peering inside the brain, and how are they formed and shaped? But more on that, possibly. Let's have another introduction from our good friend Patrick. Patrick.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Patrick Cook-Deegan, and I'm a longtime adolescent educator, CEO of a company called Wayfinder. And I think for this panel, the idea that we talked about is that well-being doesn't come from the absence of illness, but it comes from a sense of thriving and purpose and belonging and moving towards something. And when I was a high school teacher, I taught high school and led trips for 10 or 15 years. And one of my students named Jason came to me one day. I was teaching mindfulness in schools, and I taught him mindfulness. And he was like, yeah, this is cool. I like breathe and I feel better. And he was like, what do I do with my life? And I was like, that's a very good question. I was like, maybe we should teach that in schools. And the way that we teach that is what I found with adolescents, and our company specifically focus on 6th to 12th grade, is that their well-being is very tied to what they want to do with their life, why they want to do it, and helping us get them there. And so I think from my perspective, I always focus, I'm an adolescent high school guy by background, and the question I have is, how do you combine the social emotional learning skills with the future ready skills of tomorrow to make SEL more relevant for secondary students and bring them into the future that's coming? Because right now I don't think we're adequately preparing them.
Okay. Many thanks, Patrick, for that. The thoughts there. I've jotted down some excellent follow-up questions for you. Our panel are invited in this next part of the conversation to both question one another, keeping in mind being fierce on the topic, kind on the people. Plus also quite happy to field if there's any wildly urgent questions coming from the audience. We'll see whether we can allow some time at the end. If not, the esteemed panel will be trying to escape via that door the moment the session finishes in 30 minutes' time. So if you're a fanboy or girl and you need to grab something autographed or pursue a topic of interest, they won't be able to get far, providing you've got your runners on. The first topic we're going to talk around, lovely panel, is really around emotions and learning, and many of you have picked up a thread of that already, so we're going to dig in a little bit deeper. I'm going to start off with you, Helen. I guess I'm curious about the social brain. I see you've written about it extensively. You've spoken about the social brain and how people learn. Could you give us kind of like a quick overview of what that is, what it means?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think at its most fundamental, the whole brain is a social brain, and our bodies are social too, right? What we've been learning across all kinds of fields of science is that the way in which we subjectively interact with one another and construct experiences together, the emotions we have together, not only people, but all animals actually, is directly related to their health and their well-being. And we see in the brain that though we've talked for a long time about kind of cognitive skills, being sort of one thing, and then emotions and social skills being another thing, and then good SEL programming, bringing them together. What we actually see in the brain isn't like that. It's actually that this very same brain systems that tell you when you're digesting your lunch and it's sitting well with you, right? When you run up the stairs and your heart starts pounding and you feel that, right? When you go, when you see something in your way, right? Or when you get your math problem and you know how to do it, right? All of those physiological kind of little jolts that you get and then you feel and then make sense of are at once social and cognitive. It's the very, very same brain systems that literally feel your digesting of your lunch and tell you if you're getting your math problem right and tell you if you are worried or scared about something that's going on. So to think about the social brain is really to think about the whole brain. Our brains grow in social spaces.
Thanks, Mary. Nigel, you're sort of, if you like, at ground level as a director in the role that you're in presently in Chicago. Curious around what you've been experiencing, seeing and hearing from students, families and teachers over the last couple of years about emotion and learning.
Yeah, it's been wild. I'll start there. It's been so the truth of the matter is what I'm experiencing is not what I was conditioned to expect. I think a lot of what we have heard about, particularly during the pandemic, most of the local news and national news was focused on learning loss or what have you. And there were sprinklings and inklings of but what about their social development? Mm-hmm. But the large narrative was around no, kids aren't learning remotely, particularly the students that I served. But when we got back in person, what we realized was the learning, quote unquote, loss was so secondary to our kids being able to come back in spaces and feel welcome, feel loved, and also navigate the compounded trauma of what they just experienced over the last 2 years. And not only that, not only were our students unprepared for that, our staff was as well. These are still human beings who are navigating not only their own historical and intergenerational trauma, but their day-to-day machinations of I need to get up and go somewhere and be around, people and have thousands of micro interactions a day. And people were not fully functional and ready for that. And so the way that manifested with our children was almost to an extent of continued trauma on a daily basis, because now I have to function around these strangers who don't know me, who aren't welcoming, who don't love me in the way that I think I want to be loved. And how do I do that in a space and now also figure out how to do this math problem? Mm-hmm. And it became such a secondary thing that it was no longer important until we figured out how to navigate their well-being and their humanity as people in our spaces.
Thanks for that. So you touched on something that I'll just bounce over to Marc, Brackett, and then come back over this side. And that's really around the critical role of the adults and their well-being and their emotional intelligence. And Marc, I know that you've talked a lot about emotion contagion. You've talked a lot in the past about emotions as gatekeepers. Just from what you've heard, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I think taking what Mary Helen...
You're not on.
Oh, well. I was born alone speaking to myself, and I'll die alone speaking to myself. I think, what I'm hearing with Mary Helen's research, which I know very well, and Nigel as a practitioner here, is that, if I were to ask all of you right now, what's the psychological difference between anxiety, stress, pressure, fear, and overwhelmed? Mm-hmm. And this woman's looking at me I ask these questions to leaders of schools and superintendents and others, and 99% of people are they're the same thing. What are you even talking about? Now, arguably, we can get granular and specific about these things. But the truth is that we all are feeling creatures, and that we're all appraising the world around us, trying to make meaning out of that world. And we all have things happen to us. Now, what makes me feel anxious and what may make other people here feel anxious could be completely different things. But we need to agree to have a common language that anxiety has a theme of uncertainty. right? Stress has a theme of having too many demands and not enough resources. Fear is about impending danger. And we can come up with these common definitions so that we all can communicate clearly. And what we have found in our research is that if you don't really know how you feel, you don't know what to do with those feelings. And to tell everybody to take a deep breath or to do, some mindfulness exercise or yoga. Everybody does yoga now to regulate their feelings. And there's nothing wrong with yoga. I love yoga. But if I'm envious at someone's work here, I can't do downward dog and it's gonna go away. It's a little more complicated than that. And so I just feel as if we don't take seriously enough the emotion knowledge that is necessary to help teachers do this work well, not only to support their own health and well-being, but to model it and then to teach it.
Caught me out then with my microphone down. Thank you for that, Marc. Patrick, I want to just pick up, Marc referenced meaning. And what I'd like to hear are just your thoughts, particularly around the adolescent brain that you sort of have great experience in, that squishy grey mass of sort of young people ages 6 to 12, and about meaning and purpose, its significance.
Yeah, totally. So, 6 to 12, you mean grade 6 to 12? Possibly. Yeah, okay, cool. So I think of adolescents from 12 to 24. And I think two things Marc said. One is that human beings are meaning makers, and that in adolescence, our work is largely based off the work of Bill Damon at Stanford. And one of his favorite quotes that we use is that adolescents today are not overwhelmed by stress, they're overwhelmed by meaninglessness, and that when you understand why you're doing something, it changes everything else. And the other thing that Marc said was anxiety is created by uncertainty. So if students simultaneously are anxious about the world, which if you went to that climate panel, I would be anxious about the world, and then two, don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, they're probably gonna feel rudderless and anxious. And so our work is really about three things. So one is around meaning, one is around belonging, and one is around purpose. And so first you have to scaffold a sense of meaning, then you have to build a sense of belonging, particularly we have a middle school curriculum that's built around belonging. And then in high school, it's around defining and developing a sense of purpose. And we use Bill Damon's definition, which says something that's meaningful to the self and consequential and pro-social to the world. So the way I think about it is important to you, and then you have to know what's meaningful to do that, and then it's something about the world, and then you put them together, and then you put it into action. And so if you look at Dan Siegel's work at UCLA, which you know 100 times better, so I'm not about to talk about it, I'm gonna sound like a fool, but basically, that is why adolescents, when they say they're risk takers, they do crazy things, they do all this, it's actually they're looking for meaning and purpose, and they're wired evolutionary to take risks, because that's what you had to do. And so how do you scaffold experiences to help them take healthy risks, to develop a sense of meaning? And I think what I've seen is that when humans understand why they're doing what they're doing, everything else changes. And I think, to Marc's point, if I feel anxious because I have to do something, but I understand why I'm doing it, it's very different from feeling anxious and having no idea why, or before that, not even understanding what that feeling is.
Great, thanks for that. I'll pick up the sort of the self-regulation piece a little bit later on in the conversation and bounce that around everyone, because I heard that coming through. Wanting to take risks is great, and it helps us to learn, and we're engineered for it. And then we've got self-regulation sitting somewhere along the line to both protect us and others. I really liked what you talked about in terms of finding the way to positively contribute as a way of making meaning and finding purpose. So thank you for that. I've heard a little bit being talked about around, I guess, the importance of developing emotional granularity, that specificity of being able to accurately recognise and label emotions. So what I'm going to do is just ask the question of Mika here around how school day, or how a solution, an approach that you've been responsible for developing, how does it actually help kids to get better at understanding and labeling their emotions?
That's that's a great question, and I think Dan Siegel was mentioned here already, and Marc, you use this quite a lot, so you have to name it to tame it. Then when we think of on a school context, well-being doesn't happen without the teacher's role. So well-being is social emotional learning, that's for sure. But in the school, we're usually talking about soft skills here. So, and then there's, I take it a little bit to the data side as well, which are the sort of hard ones. So I think measuring things helps a lot to make well-being also relevant for the school leaders and district leaders side, and really measure it, name it, and tame it, and measure it again. But the students, for us, what we've been experiencing, having a safe, anonymous platform, I mean, they really appreciate it, and just introducing something like that is taken as a huge step, and the students appreciate it a lot.
Great. Thanks, Mika. And I did steal, you have to name it to tame it, from Mr. Brackett at the end, just so, I've clarified the original owner of that throwaway line. Thank you for that. Mika, you've sort of led me to the next sort of bit that I want to talk about. We're going to just open this up to the panel after one specific question to Marc at the end, and then I'll invite the other panelists to contribute. This is really around, this is all great. How do educators and school leaders develop the capacity, the mindset, the skill set to actively support students to be their best self, particularly in a current backdrop of continued volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity? So Marc, you've undertaken recently a large study which explored how to raise teachers' wellbeing, and maybe you could just start by table setting some of the key insights there, and then I'll invite anyone in the group to raise their microphone and share thoughts around capacity building for leaders and educators. Marc?
Yeah, well, I think one of the challenges with that question is that, what day of the week, what month, because it's so volatile. When you think about when the pandemic first hit in March of 2020, actually our Castle group is here. We launched a series called Castle Cares, and we did a study with 7,000 teachers, and we found out anxiety, and I think it was because it was all what the hell's happening? What am I doing? The school's closing, not closing, this is this. And then we had, a tremendous awakening around racial injustice in our society in May and June and July, and people had other feelings. And then the summer came and everybody thought, I'm going back in the fall, and that didn't happen. And then they had more feelings. And so what we've noticed is that it's not an easy question to answer. It's something that you have to literally ask all the time. And one thing that's also interesting, I think, in our research is that we're now really looking at teachers' ideal affect. So not just asking how do you feel, but how do you want to feel? And that also shifts across time. I remember back the summer of 2020, we asked teachers, how are you going to feel? I want to feel excited. And no longer is excitement actually what teachers care about. The number one emotion in our recent study is appreciated. I just want to be seen. I want to be heard. I want someone to care about the amount of work that I'm doing to ensure our kids are doing well in school. And so my response to that really is ask the question more frequently, find out the actual feelings, find out the hoped-for feelings, and then if you're in a school system, think creatively about what you can do to ensure that you're supporting educators and experiencing the emotions that they want to feel more of to support their well-being.
Thanks, Marc. Bouncing on to the rest of our panel, the topic of discussion is, how do we build capacity, skills, mindsets, dispositions of educators or leaders? We've heard Marc just comment, ask again and again and again, invite the conversation around emotion, feed that into everyday part of your culture. What else should we be doing? They're so polite. They're self-regulating to such a degree, nobody's going to say anything.
I'll go after you.
We're very polite up here. So I think one of the questions we have to, or things we have to reckon with when it comes to capacity is that for generations at this point, we've been and our teachers, our educational workforce has been conditioned to see results as the result of their labor since ESEA in '65 all the way to ESSA, as of a few years ago. And so right now when we're in this space where results may not be happening, and there's a panic to Marc's point around like those results not happening, it's like, well, now I'm ineffective, and now I can't be appreciated for the thing that I'm supposed to be doing well because I'm not doing that thing well. But we have to like recondition and recatalyze like our workforce around like putting what I would call the cart before the human, and the human before the cart or what have you, is that like we have a space now where we can truly look at recognizing that the well-being of who's in front of us, and if that means I'm a district leader, it means like the people that are on the ground like in our schools. If I'm a principal, it means my teachers. If I'm a teacher, it means my students. Like if I prioritize like the well-being of those individuals first, that secondary thing of results, quote unquote, which is what we've always sought after, will come. And it's just hard to like shift the mindset to go to that space, because like it's been so natural to say like the outcome is what should be the outcome, but it's not. The inputs is what will get you your outcome, and right now we just are not doing well with inputs. And I think there's a place for us to get better at it, but we aren't there yet.
And can I build off that? And I love that. The outcome's not the outcome, right? It's the inputs and the process. And so one of the things that I would add to this is helping teachers and kids, especially adolescents, right, to recognize the meaning they're making out of the emotions that they're having, like what we've been hearing. So I'll just tell you about one neuroscience study that we've got that I think is super relevant to this conversation. So we have been following, a modest-sized cohort of kids, 65 kids, for several years, many years, since they were 15, 16 years old. They're now in their 20s. And when they were 15 and 16, we sat them down and we talked to them about the meaning they're making of their world. How do you think about the crime you've seen in your environment, right? How do you think about your possible future self? I call you back in 10 years and everything's been going great for you. Who are you, right? And we share with them stories about real teenagers from around the world in all kinds of situations and ask them, how does this person's story make you feel? You can say whatever you want. And then we move them in the MRI scanner and we have them think about those things again. And we look at what's happening in their brain and in their body while they're doing that, and they're pushing buttons to tell us, I'm super emotionally engaged with this right now, right? Or I'm not. And then they come out. And what happened? What is amazingly important is that the ways kids were making meaning out of their lives and out of stories actually was related to the way that they activated their brains when they were thinking about those stories and emotions in the scanner. So executive control was activating and then deactivating, it turns out. Emotions were really high and like various kinds of brain networks were going. And that's cool. But even cooler is that when those things happened, when kids made what we call transcendent meaning, they didn't just stay in the here and now about like the story, but they started to think about what does this mean for people's future, for what I could do, for the bigger emotions I should experience, like being appreciated, those kinds of big stories, right? When they did that, we could predict that their brains would grow more over the next 2 years in every way we could study it. So the structure of their brain, how thick the brain gray matter is, the ways that the white matter tracks were going into their frontal lobes. And this, what's so cool is it's above and beyond the effects of IQ. So we measured full-scale IQ. We also measured their family socioeconomic status and parents' education level and stuff. Those things did not explain it. It's the ways kids were making stories out of their lives that explain the growth, and in turn, the growth in their brain, so not what kind of brain you have, right? Not your brain versus my brain, but like how much did you grow over the last 2 years? How much did Mary Helen grow over the last 2 years? That growth, in turn, predicts how happy you are as a young adult. How much you like yourself, how much you like your close relationships, how, like what we call coherent is your identity, right? Like for those of you who know Erickson, right? Like, or how diffuse, like I don't really know right from wrong, I just kind of follow the crowd, right? You know, the things that we really care about for our young people, saying as a 22-year-old, my work or my school is really important to what I want to do with my life and I'm really enjoying the opportunity it's providing me, those things are predicted years before by the brain growth that's associated with the way they are experiencing and making meaning of the emotions they're having. So we really need to learn as educators and as kids too, to recognize those stories and learn how to build the kinds of stories that grow us, the kinds of stories that contribute to purpose, to meaning, to relationships, to community.
I have just one quick comment related to that. In our study of, I think it was around 40,000 high schoolers, the top 3 emotions were tired, bored, and stressed, 75%. When we asked them their hoped-for feelings, it was inspiration. And we asked them, well, what would help you get there? And they said, if learning would just be more relevant and meaningful. So.
Yes, that's right.
Well, I agree with everything, because what students want is relevance and meaning and relationships. So I think it made me think of one student. We teach at a school in New York City, and I think the first thing, and what Nigel was saying too, is that what most gets educators into education, I think, is relationships and changing students' lives. And what young people want from educators is a relationship. And some of the best research indicates the more healthy adult-youth relationships in a building, it's the best indicator of how the school is doing. So then what are we doing to build those relationships is a question, and what's the glue that does that? And so that's the curriculum that we've tried to create, is something that builds relationships between students and teachers, between students and themselves, and then have them imagine the future that they want to live. And I don't think we do enough of that imagining. And there was one student we went to go visit in New York City, and his teacher was awesome. She was one of those teachers that all the students love. And he was like a C student. He just was like, what's the point? He would come to school, didn't know the point. And we have a few activities around imagining what your life could be if you could just go for it. And so he ended up over the course doing this project, and he's like, oh, I want to create videos. I want to become a filmmaker. And he'd thought about it, but he never thought he could do it. And then he did a number of activities, and then he landed on it, and then he was gung-ho, and then his teacher was like, to be a filmmaker, you're gonna have to get decent grades, and you might have to go to college, you might have to do these other things. And then he was like, oh, okay, so that's why I'm going to school? Cool, then I'm gonna try at school. And then next semester, his GPA went from a 1.7 to a 3.4. And he was like, well, now I have a reason to try, and I didn't have a reason to try before. And so I think if you give people a reason to try, well, they're going to try. And I don't think we give them enough tools or reasons to try for the imagined future that they want in their brains.
I'll try to frame this up for a question for you, Mika, from what we've heard just in that part then. We did a survey across 3 countries at the end of last year, and we asked the question of teachers, what do you need to know more about in order to best support your students? And out of the 1,000 teachers, not one said, I need more information on word accuracy or times tables or, quick facts or sight words. They labelled 3 things. One was they needed to know the complexities their students faced both inside and outside the school. The second thing they wanted to know was about the emotions that their students were feeling. And the third thing was they wanted to know about what motivated their students. And I've heard that come through here, grounded in brain science. The brain has got more neurons in it than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So, Mika, the insights that teachers are getting from school day, how is that changing their practice? Have you got a brief success story of people using a technology tool to help inform and change practice for the better?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, technology doesn't solve everything, that's for sure. But we see that technology can help a lot, and educators are saying that, for example, school days, providing them lots of helpful information to help their students. This especially is, of course, relevant, as Patrick has mentioned, in the younger age groups, the teacher probably knows the students fairly well. With the older ones, not necessarily the same case. So that's one example. But when you then think of systemic change, and there's a little bit positives here, because pre-pandemic, we had, lots of work to do just to convince that well-being is so important for learning. Seriously, I mean, it was seen as a nice to have thing. And now 2 years afterwards, is no one sort of disagrees, and it has become a priority. So there's lots of hope in a sense. So, because on a school or district level, the teachers need to have the systemic support from the school leaders as well, drilling down. So it boils down to leadership's role, and we've seen some great example in that area.
Awesome, thanks for that. And speaking of going to scale and using technology, Marc, you've just kicked off a new partnership just recently with Pinterest. Is this now a good time just to give us a quick whisper of what that is and how it might help us?
Sure. I just want to make one follow-up to that very briefly, which is that I think when we think about systemic, we need to think much broader than our schools. We need to think about our communities, our counties. I mean, there are states that I won't mention here that they're damaging children's healthy development because of policies that are uninformed by developmental science. And so that just needs to stop, because if we don't fix that or educate people about those things, the children are going to be the ones who are going to suffer. Just very briefly, talk about compartmentalizing. I'm very happy to say that we have an app that we've been working on for 2 years. It's based on a tool that we use in our model called the Mood Meter. And what's really special about this tool is that A, it's going to be available for free across the world, and B, it uses emotion science to help people track 144 of their emotions. And specifically, it helps you to think about how you're feeling, where you are, what you're doing, and who you're with, and allows you to look at that longitudinally and then choose research-based strategies to help you manage those emotions throughout your day and track the progress that you're making in healthy regulation. So it's called How We Feel, and it will be released in about a month.
Awesome, that sounds terrific. 144 emotions, got to catch them all. We're going to wrap up the panel in a couple of moments. I will quickly just ask each of the panelists just for their final thought to leave in your brain, and it needs to be a very pithy, tiny, tiny little thought. Let's start off right here with you, Mika.
Well, I'd say the last thought is that I see that education globally has been too grade performance focused, and that is now changing, which is a great thing. And I am very optimistic how education and learning will evolve going forwards.
Mine would be don't leave the high schoolers out. I'm a high school guy, and if you read the Surgeon General's report, the worst mental health of any population segment in America during COVID has been adolescents, and they're hit hard. And if we do what we used to do, it doesn't work. It wasn't working before, and it's definitely not going to work moving forward. So we need to address what's going on. Even though it's the hardest, I think it's the most important.
I'd say to really take seriously people's subjective experiences of the places where they are in school and in communities, because it's those subjective experiences as they see and feel them that really matter for how they grow and develop over time.
I think we have to move from being resource rich and system poor. Like, I think all of the apps and brains up here are brilliant, but what do we do to work in combination with Wayfinder and the brilliant minds at USC and Yale, where they combine to work for my kids in Inglewood, both Chicago and LA.
I appreciate that. And the last thing I'll just say is that I think in order for us to not look back, as I've done the last 30 years, say, what have we accomplished in the last 30 years in the field? And say, gosh, we have a lot more to do. We need to start moving away from kind of quick fixes and piecemeal models and really thinking critically about how to make this a permanent part of education.
It's been a pleasure. Let's give it up for our wonderful panel.